The speech from the throne. We apologize for pushing back the meeting over and over again. As you understand, it went a little bit long and all that kind of stuff. So the National Chief's going to start off with his first feelings, and then we'll go from there. We'll have questions and answer after that. So, National Chief, would you like to say some words to the kind people here?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon to you all, friends and relatives, and everybody listening. The speech from the throne is done now. One of the things that stuck out for me, all the details, but there was they're going to build on their 2019 commitments. That was said in this speech. But then they also expounded on some details that jumped out at me were two new pieces of legislation. One on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then policing as an essential service. So two new pieces of legislation. We did advocate for that. I took heart as well, the speeding up of the infrastructure gap to be closed as well. They mentioned housing, they mentioned water, they mentioned broadband. So MIW, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the National Action Plan that has to be implemented, walking the road of reconciliation. They mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. So everything that we've advocated for, and I see that mentioned in this throne speech. But again, I've said before that the throne speech is the high level priorities. And now we worked to influence and get priorities from First Nations into the throne speech, which I'm going to say are there. Now the next step, there's two more pieces that we've got to ensure happen, that they're reflected in the mandate letters from the Prime Minister to the ministers. So we're going to continue our advocacy for that to happen. And then as well, they have to be reflected in the next federal budget. And so those are the next two pieces of work where, like, our work's not done. In another way, it just continues. And it's our job at the Assembly of First Nations to ensure that those high-level priorities that are espoused in this throne speech are now reflected in the mandate letters and in the federal budget. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I think the priorities I've outlined are things we've been advocating for, and I'll leave it at that and take questions.
All right, if you could put your question, or just let me know if you have a question, put it in the chat function, and then I'll say your name.
Sup?
All right, Christy, would you ask a question, please? Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for doing this. I noticed in the throne speech that there's a commitment to implement the UN, the legislation on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I know that you were pushing for kind of a two-part commitment that the government would implement and then pass the bill within a year. Are you disappointed that part two isn't there, a commitment to ensure the passage of legislation within a year's time?
Again, you build upon that, Christy, in the sense that it's going to be introduced. They talked about introduction, and I equate it to even Bill C91 on the language bill and Bill C92 on child welfare. When we had the press conferences for those two pieces of legislation, I said I won't rest and I won't be happy until I hear two words: royal assent. And I'm going to take that same principle to these two new pieces of legislation that are espoused in the throne speech. The one on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and on policing as essential service. So we have to get them introduced as soon as possible. And then it takes the precarious journey between the House of Commons and the Senate and everybody else that wants to make changes to these important pieces of legislation. But we have to maneuver it through that system. So I'm going to keep urging the Prime Minister and Minister Lametti to introduce that piece of legislation as soon as possible.
May I ask a follow-up? Is that how we're doing this?
Please do.
Just as a quick follow-up, I wanted to ask you, I know back in June you were talking about the need for a zero tolerance policy, particularly for the RCMP, given concerns around policing that have come to light, especially in recent months. What did you make of the government's commitment around looking at standards for the use of force and a commitment to reform the RCMP?
Again, that's something that we've been advocating for as well, Christy, in the sense that you can't just deal with policing as essential service in terms of legislation. You have to couple that with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police overview and a policy and program overview as well. And so they referenced a number of pieces in the throne speech, and you touched on one, the use of excessive force. And I've in my discussions with the Prime Minister And even with the commissioner, I've said there's 4 or 5 things that can be looked at. And one of them is the zero tolerance policy for excessive use of force. Number 2, the use of body cams. Number 3, strengthening the civilian oversight committee in the RCMP. Number 4, better recruitment processes when you come into the RCMP in terms of weeding out the racist and biased attitudes. So things can happen. Better cultural training. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 recommendations, but that's, again, doesn't require a piece of legislation. It requires a process to start revamping and overviewing policies and procedures internally within the RCMP. Even the simple name, don't call it a force, call it a service. It's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Service, and it's serving all Canadians, including First Nations people. So that should be happening. I'm glad it was referenced in the throne speech. Now the work begins. We've got to push for that process to start happening. Okay.
Any other questions out there? Okay, Brett, if you'd like to shoot your question.
You guys hear me now? Yeah?
Got you, Brad.
Okay, let me just ask, was there anything you thought was missing? Was there anything you thought was left out, things you wanted to hear but perhaps didn't hear in this throne speech?
Well, again, anything, there wasn't a specific chapter, right? Like the throne speech from last year. So that was very obvious. But I am going to hang on to the commitment on that one line. All the commitments from the previous throne speech, 2019, we're going to build upon, because in the other one that was talked about last year was mechanisms for treaty implementation. And we're all treaty people. We're sharing the land and resource wealth, no question. But new mechanisms to look at implementation and enforcement of the treaty according to the spirit and intent. New mechanisms to look at the implementation of Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, which recognizes existing Aboriginal treaty rights. And you can even say, look at the issue we're having on the East Coast with the lobster fisheries, you know, in terms of what's going on there with the lack of implementation of the Marshall decision, the Supreme Court of Canada decision, because they have a treaty, but it hasn't been honored nor implemented. So that's causing problems. So you can start looking at mechanisms and ways to start looking at treaty enforcement and implementation according to the spirit and intent. And that not only applies to our international historical treaties, but even the modern day treaties. You got to look at implementation processes. So that was something that wasn't specifically mentioned, but I'm going to put that into building on 2019 commitments.
As a follow-up, if I may, you know, how confident are you that you're going to see results on all this? You know, are you worried at all that this is just going to get perhaps punted down the election cycle because the throne speech was very pandemic focused? Is there any concern that things might just get steamrolled or put on the back burner as the pandemic takes the forefront here?
Well, Brett, good question. Very good question. But it's our job at the Assembly of First Nations to make sure that that doesn't happen. That's our job, to advocate, to make sure that those priorities espoused in this throne speech are reflected in the mandate letters and are reflected in the next federal budget. And that's our job. So like I said before, the work begins now of lobbying, advocacy, talking to as many ministers and deputy ministers and chiefs of staff, everybody that we can to influence this next cycle. Because when all those issues that they talked about, from making investments in housing and water and infrastructure and broadband for everybody, that's not just good for First Nations people, that's good for Canada, because that gap starts to close. And that's what we have to do. These are investments for not only First Nations, but basically you're building a better country when you start doing that. And that's our job at AFN to advocate for that so that we see that reality happen. All right? Okay.
Are there any other questions out there? National Chief, I actually have a question. You know, one of the things that was mentioned over and over again was the idea of building back better. Is there a First Nation idea, or do we have ideas on how Canada could build back better for First Nations?
Well, another good question, Michael. And again, that's the theme in terms of building back better. Like, there are risks, but there are huge opportunities. And this is, again, the need to balance the economy with environment, you know, and making sure that any opportunities, if you're starting to look at you know, the clean, green economy, that First Nations are involved, and making sure there's always a balance and respect for the land and the water going forward, that there are sustainable development programs, and the rights and title holders are actually involved in designing anything going forward, whether that be at the national level or at the provincial territorial level, that First Nations rights and title holders need to be involved. That ties into even on a global stage, like Building Back Better. All countries have a role to play in meeting the Paris climate change targets, you know, and zero, the world is warming. It has to be underneath 2 degrees. And so there's a huge opportunity now to, build back better. But all countries of the world, all CEOs in the private sector need to embrace that concept of building back better, or even on a larger global stage, the Great Reset. And that's something we have to be involved with, and bringing our elders' traditional knowledge about balancing the environment, the economy, getting back to the balance between our natural world, our natural elements, respecting the land and water for future generations. And that's why we're value added as Indigenous peoples. Our worldview should lead that way. So that's an important piece as well that was reflected in this throne speech. But we got to take it to an international audience as well.
All right. Are there any more questions?
No.
All right. It doesn't look like. So thank you, everybody, for attending and your interest. And thank you, National Chief, for your good words. And if any of you have any questions, please email me after, and we'll see what we can get for you. All right. We'll be sending out a press release shortly. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Be safe.